But first, our top story, which takes us to the negotiating tables, where unfortunately railroad unions are not happy with the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations. Following this story is Joanna Marsh, who joins us now.
Thank you for being with us this morning. Good to have you as always. Let's talk about this. We talked with Mike Bowdenistel a little bit about kind of what the Emergency Board was recommending last week, but it seems like since we've had some time to get some reaction from the unions who are saying this is not quite good enough.
Yeah. So the initial reaction from one of the unions, one of the big ones, Smart Transportation Division, the president, last week said that, they were a little disappointed, quite frankly, about how the recommendations turned out. I think the unions were kind of hoping for something, of course, that favored their position a little bit more. So that's one person. And then actually a lot of the unions also have been fairly quiet about how they're viewing things, just more sort of encouraging members to look at the recommendations and sort of read the report and kind of take everything in.
And giving a little bit of background for folks who are unaware with the situation, we've got this Presidential Advisory Board moving down. How did we get here? Was this something that was months in the making?
Yeah, it was in a way. So there is a law, federal law, that kind of governs the negotiating process called the Railway Labor Act. And so, of course, every so many years, you have the contract negotiations happen. And so that kind of officially started around January 2020. And it's actually taken a very, very long time for the negotiations to I guess there's just a lot of issues that both sides weren't able to come to agreement on, and so earlier this spring, both the railroads and the unions decided that the negotiations aren't going anywhere, and so they ended up having the contract negotiations go before a federal mediation board, which has actually mediated some other similar conflicts in the past. And so the Federal Mediation Board tried to negotiate between both parties, and that didn't happen. And all of these procedures kind of fall under what you should be doing under the Railway Labor Act. And so after that happened, there was a month of a cooling off period, which means, the union members can't strike, or, no one can take action. And then President Joe Biden appointed that advisory board, the Presidential Emergency Board, which was 3 members, and it serves as a impartial voice. And so all 3 members, have had experience in labor negotiations, some of them in rail, but they're serving as an impartial voice. And so they took testimony from the railroads and the unions, and they had a lot of hearings. And so that process occurred for over a month. And so they released their recommendations, taking in all that information. And those recommendations came out last week, a 124-page report.
So, Joanna,
That's
I think
a lot.
it was a lot to get here, and we still have a lot of ground to kind of go before some final decisions get made around this. And I think one of the things that came out that we've talked to Mike about was that Joe Biden is pretty pro-labor, pro-union. And I think a lot of the folks are surprised that the Presidential Review Board came down on the side that was more in favor of the railroads and more in favor of service standards and the way that things are doing that will benefit both the shippers and the railroads, not necessarily the workers and the unions. Do you think that this was something that was a surprise and also part of their contention with why they're so upset about this?
I think so. I think, I think there was a move on the union side to try to push towards having this emergency board. And so that's kind of why the timeline occurred as it did. That's what some people say anyway. And so I think there was some surprise, especially, you have Biden, and then you have a lot of, the noise that's been going on with the supply chain and with the rail service delays. And so I think, it seemed like it was sort of the time to strike while the iron's hot, so to speak. And instead the recommendations, while they address the union's concerns and sort of their asks, they pretty much say that while these issues are important, just kind of looking at past precedents, the issues of sort of relating to work-life balance and workplace conditions have been addressed more on a local level, and so I guess that's why they said that they were hesitant to sort of delve into that. And so a lot of the recommendations that they did provide are related to wage increases and sort of healthcare benefits, and sort of so there are some things that obviously the healthcare benefits and the wage increases are also big issues for the union members, and so those got addressed, but some of the other things didn't, and so I think that's where there was some disappointment.
So unions are basically a little disappointed that they got to, here's some money, get back to work kind of a situation. And they wanted more to address that work-life balance, right?
I think so. Yeah. But, at the same time, they've also been going without a contract for over they've been going without a wage increase for over 2.5 years. And so, that's another thing too, especially, with inflation these days and then prices and stuff getting higher.
Right. And the other side of this is kind of where the railroads are stuck, right? Because they're having trouble finding and keeping skilled labor. They're saying that that's a lot of their problem, is just the labor issue. But they're also having to deal with incredible pressure from their shippers and their users right now to get those service standards up. And it's kind of this cyclical problem, right? If you don't have the people to work, then you can't have as much the service standards that you need. Then if you don't have the service standards, you get more pressure on your existing workers, and it just builds around and around. Is there a point where either the railroads or the unions, or you step in from a federal side and you cut that cycle and you say, okay, this is the problem, this is how we're going to address it, and this is where at least we hope to start solving the problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, you kind of could take it from both sides. I think there is, a lot of momentum with the rail service issues and supply chain challenges and wanting to resolve that. And so you have the Surface Transportation Board trying to address that issue, and because the supply, the rail service issues have been brought about in part because of staffing levels, as you mentioned. But then you also have the other side, which is sort of the midterm elections and like what will happen then. If I guess, there are multiple things that could happen. Later this fall in terms of the negotiations. I guess one is, that there actually is an agreement. And we also have to remember that there are about 12 unions, I could be wrong, like give or take around that number. And so each one will be sort of negotiating individually, even though they've been working collectively as a group. They'll also be working individually in terms of their contracts, and so you might have some unions proceeding with a contract and others not, and then there's also the possibility of a strike. That's not completely off the table. There's also the option of Congress intervening as well, and that's actually kind of tying back into the midterm elections. It's sort of like what could happen there, because I mean, on one hand you have people in the House that could favor the union side, but then we don't know about what's going to happen with the Senate and how will midterm elections, how could that influence the outcome of things? So it is pretty complicated.
And looking forward here, we got about a minute left. What are the thoughts moving forward? Do we have a cooling off period? Do they take it to the union reps? Do they carte blanche it? Like, what should we be looking for now in the next steps?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, everyone's just kind of waiting with bated breath in a sense, because there is that disappointment. But then you kind of balance that. I think some of the union leaders, like, you have to balance. So you have the membership disappointment, but then you also have that need to get the contract rolling. And so what do you do there? And so they're kind of in a tough spot. And then of course, shippers. Actually, one of the shippers groups yesterday sort of issued an announcement saying, let's keep that ball rolling with the negotiations. So we'll see.
Joanna, and the last question for you really quickly. You mentioned the midterm elections. Do you think that there could be anyone who kind of uses this as a political posturing play and say, you know what, I'm going to come down on the side of either the railroads or side of the unions and use that as kind of a boost to get them into this election seat? Or do you think that the main action will happen after the midterms are decided?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I think it's, I think even for both sides, it's trying to sort of tie the railroad issues with how that's affecting the everyday consumer, and whether that's in terms of like higher transportation costs mean higher end prices for consumers, or whether that means trying to sort of elicit empathy for workers and the hours that they have. So.
Thanks so much, Joanna. We really appreciate it. We're going to be keeping an eye on these developments as well. Hopefully, we can all just get along.
All right, take care.
All right, Joanna, thanks for that. Have a good weekend. Right now, we're going to head on over to The Wall this morning. We've got our first carrier update ready to go with Tony Mulvey and Donnie Gilbert.